Thank you for joining today's panel, a discussion on moving health products from R&D to the clinic, how the private sector might play an increased role in low and middle income countries. This panel discussion is being hosted by the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. For those of you not familiar with WDI, we are an independent nonprofit research and educational organization housed within the University of Michigan's Stephen M. Ross School of Business. Our mission is to equip economic decision makers in emerging countries with the tools of commercial success, because business drives economic growth and social freedom. My name is Pascal Leroy, and I'm the Vice President of Healthcare at WDI, and I'll be serving as today's moderator. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, Vivian Xu, who's the Strategy and Operations Lead for Vaccine Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Second, Subhash Kapra, who's the CEO of Enterprise and former Executive Director of the Serum Institute of India. Third, Michael Borowitz, the Advisor for Strategic Partnerships at the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. And finally, Greg Visness, who's a Senior Fellow here at WDI and Vice President at Charles River Associates. So before we get started, I'd like to define what we mean by the private sector. For the purposes of this discussion, I would like to focus on for-profit organizations, while recognizing that the nonprofit organizations play a critical role in healthcare in many emerging markets across the world. And when we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about all the elements that go into making the healthcare system work. So that means everything from procurement to supply chain to the actual products and services that are provided at the clinic or hospital level. And so with that, let's get started. So we know that the private sector already plays a large role in low and middle income countries in terms of healthcare. For example, in the manufacturing space, firms like Serum Institute of India, where Subhash worked. In the supply chain space, we have places like Imperial Health Sciences in South Africa. In the delivery space, we have countless numbers of health clinics and hospitals across the LMICs. Yet many of us believe that we need more private sector engagement. And so my first question is to Vivian. A number of large global health donors, including your own, have explicit objectives of increasing involvement of the private sector at various points along that healthcare value chain. Why do you think donors think that the private sector has the potential to play a larger role in healthcare in low and middle income countries?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Pascal. I think when we think about a lot of our investments across the board, what's our end objective, especially on the R&D side? I think it's a lot about, ensuring a secure, sustainable supply of, high quality, appropriately priced health products that meet the needs of LMIC users, meet the target product profiles of, our target markets. In order to do that, we have to work with the private sector. That's where these products are coming from. So I think it's less of a question of, big or small role that they're playing, but the recognition that the private sector has all of these assets, whether it be technologies, whether it be monetary capital, geographic footprint of supply chains, or probably most importantly, human capital and talent. How are we best leveraging those assets? How are we maximizing those assets that exist for global health? I think the other thing that we have to think about and be careful about is when we talk about the private sector, it's really not a monolith. It's, there's so many different parts and pieces to the private sector when it comes to global health. You've got big pharma, which is sort of the top of mind, frequent player, but there's also, all the developing country vaccine manufacturers, there's generic manufacturers, there's, hospitals, as you note, you've got, logistics companies, biotechs globally. And so the needs and wants and engagement that we can get from each of these different types of organizations varies. And are we casting a big enough net, I think is really the question.
Right. So it sounds like the private sector basically can provide things that we don't necessarily think that the public sector can do on their own. They have different channels, different expertise, et cetera. So it's a necessity more than anything. That's right. So Michael, you're also coming from the donor side, but you're coming from the Global Fund, which often has a more country perspective than other donors. So first, I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to add from what Vivian had said. And second, how have you seen the desire to engage the private sector evolve over time within the donor space?
So, I mean, as Vivian said, obviously a lot of the products are produced outside of the countries that we're working in. You know, we work in low-income countries like Malawi and stuff like that, that are not necessarily producing pharmaceuticals or vaccines. So in some of the poorest countries and stuff like that. So I think the critical issue is once they reach the port of the country, how are they distributed? And I think that's the area where the Global Fund has been most interested in engaging with the private sector. Because often the logistics system, say the central medical source system, is not necessarily working particularly well. And there's stockouts. And so the question is how, if we want to get these new commodities directly to the clinic, can we actually either try to make that system work? And I think obviously one of the areas is in engagement with the private sector. And that's, you know, really supply chain logistics that are not necessarily even specific to pharmaceuticals. It could be a broader delivery system, more like DHL. And the Global Fund has obviously been trying all different experiments in this area, including, you know, working with the private sector like Coca-Cola and the last mile. So I think that the private sector, if you look at OECD countries, the majority of OECD countries, supply chain is private. Even the British National Health Service no longer uses a central medical stores model. So I think that's one of the critical issues, is around how to actually balance a central medical store system, which many of the countries that we work in have, but then also to engage with the private sector at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. So the second part of the question I had was about how that's evolved over time. For example, if we think about 20 years ago, were people in the global health sector eager to engage the private sector, or is this something that's cropped up more over the last decade or 5 years, for example?
Well, I think wider engagement of the private sector is now kind of like one of an in thing. It's often called public-private partnership. Right. Actually, you can see that most interestingly in tuberculosis, where it's part of the whole Stop TB strategy around engagement, and that's around more on service delivery. And in fact, the Global Fund has just recently hired maybe 5 private sector advisors, you know, some in the supply chain, but actually much more broadly in service delivery. So I do think that the new area is really around service delivery, engaging with private service delivery. If you look at places like India or Pakistan, I mean, most service delivery occurs in the private sector. And so the public sector is just a small portion of the service delivery system. And yet in public health, we tend to concentrate on the public system. So I think that is the sea change. You know, I think that historically public health is concentrated on the public sector. And there's really now seem to be the need to engage, if we're going to achieve public health objectives, to engage with the private sector. And I think that's perhaps most forcefully illustrated by tuberculosis, where, say, in India, Pakistan, there's huge issues around missing cases that are in the private sector. And if we're going to ever achieve any kind of tuberculosis control in those countries, it's going to require active engagement with the private sector.
Yeah, yeah. So Subhash, when you look at the landscape of healthcare in low and middle income countries, do you see the same type of opportunity that Vivian and Michael alluded to, or are you more skeptical of for whatever reason, of the ability of the private sector to play an increased role?
First response, I would say, the mindset. You know, a mindset of a company is very important, you know, in engaging in producing vaccines for low-income countries. My past experience, currently I'm working with InventRise, and earlier I was working in Serum Institute of India. So the first product, you know, that we made for UNICEF was a measles vaccine, which was pre-qualified in 1989. So the answer to your question is how far we have been in this low income country situation. That was like 20 or 19 cents a dose, you know, that's what we supplied. When there is, you know, when we start doing a vaccine manufacture, let's say in India, for instance, at that point of time, the public sector was there who was producing vaccines without profit at the government subsidies and all that, and a price was set for procurement for the government agencies for population immunization. Mm-hmm. Question that came up was, how are we going to get into a competition on a price factor? Yeah, because we have a bar that is set by the government agency. Right. And then comes the will of a company to go there, and also what is the innovation that we can bring in, which was not there in the public sector, that enabled us to make some profit there so that we could economically survive, and make the product, which is a very important factor. To give you an example, in this particular case of measles vaccine, you can produce the virus, in a very large quantity. It grows very well. You get some titers like log 10 raised to 6.2, 6.3 with multiple harvests. And so when we come down to a dose level, it's very minimal in that quantity. But you have a secondary packaging and packaging that adds on cost, Then you have human cost, then you have the financial cost of the institution, the quality control and all that. So, and I had just done my biochemistry, in masters. So all this was a new arena for me, and jumping from the bulk making into how do we have efficiency in dosaging was a challenge in front of me. So first thing that I engaged in was getting into a 500 vial per minute line in 1989, which was the first thing that came into India, so that we could make a large number of doses in a quicker time. Second thing was, how do I package a 10-dose material in a smallest vial? So we had designed a vial of 17 mm dia, and a height of 40 millimeters, so that in a lyophilizer, we could put in about 100,000 vials, where in the Western world, the numbers in the same space was something like 40,000. And when we put a 10-dose in that, it immediately jumped up into a huge number of doses made per day. And that reduced the cost per dose, of what was happening on a daily basis. Now, to get this technologically possible was a challenge, because the glass tubings in those days in India were bad. The diameters would vary a lot. And on a machine that was going to do 500 containers a minute, you needed to have an accurate diameter and accurate size of the vial. And that, I had to work on how to get the tubing and how to make the vial, blah, blah. It has nothing to do with biochemistry, but we did that, and we were able to package the thing very well. And then we were able to produce large numbers per day and reduce the price and make it economically viable. So I must say that just will of doing something is not enough. To compete in that bar that is there, technological innovations have to be there. There have to be so many things that take you into that arena of competition. And then, of course, this caught on because that bar was always kept as far as going into the UNICEF markets for everyone, who came on the scene as manufacturers. So that intent, of getting there is a driving force, I would say. And to try and see whether we could make that economically viable is the second option that has to be sort of exercised and done well, that would make this a success. And I would not say that everyone would want to go through this, because it's a rigorous process, because there is no way that you can engage and commit losses and kind of make the vaccines. And so those who are willing to get into that system are the private sector that will be always there.
Right. So we've talked a little bit about, why some groups, including donors and potentially the private sector organizations themselves, want more engagement in the private sector. But that we really haven't talked about why they're not there already. Although Subhash, you just alluded to it with this concept of this idea of profit, that you have to be able to make money or else you're not going to want to go into it. As someone who's coming in at this from a business lens, my naive response to what you've been saying about this question about why don't we have more private sector within particular parts of the market is that the businesses don't see, if there was a potential for profit, they would walk into it. They don't see necessarily the immediate benefit of engaging. So Subhash, you guys were able to capitalize on something that you saw was possible, but that may not be true for other companies. And Greg, as an economist, I wonder if you could help provide a framework to talk about what determines whether a private sector company will play or not play in a particular space.
Well, sure, and thanks for having me on this panel. As long as we're talking about for-profit firms, we're talking about kind of a special beast of firms. And by definition, is what a for-profit firm has to be interested in, is its profits. Now, we see a lot of for-profit firms playing to some extent in the, I'll call it the nonprofit sector, doing things that don't seem to be all that profit motivated, sort of taking on social responsibilities. And I think a lot of firms, for-profit firms, will do that. You can think of it as being in their long-term profit incentives to build up their image, or that they, frankly, they have enough money that they can afford to spend some of it on social responsibility type issues. But I think if we want real serious engagement, something more beyond token engagement by a lot of these firms, we have to fundamentally come back to they're out there to make money. And what can we do if we really want more engagement from them? If we want to be able to benefit, as Vivian was talking about, on all the benefits they can bring to the table, it ultimately has to be a little bit in their incentive to do so already.
Right.
And I think to some extent, it's kind of easy to develop a framework then that says what's going to affect whether or not a firm is going to want to participate. What levers do we have as policymakers to try to encourage their involvement in the field? And when you come down to it, well, what does profit involve? And part of it is price, okay? And part of what we're going to be seeing here is that it is going to be costly to engage the for-profit sector, because it's not quite a 0-1 game, but to some extent, giving them more money means that whoever's paying for it is going to be left with less. So offering higher prices, basically paying them more for their services, is going to increase their involvement. But a lot of times that's not really in the budget set or something that folks want to do. But there are other levers that can be used as well. So the other way to encourage their participation is to increase, in essence, the total volume they expect from the contract, from the engagement. Now, what are some of the implications of this? Well, one of the implications is to be a little bit wary, or at least recognize the consequences of splitting contracts among multiple different providers. If you're only giving each one of these suppliers 20% of the total contract, you're not going to get as much enthusiasm for participating in that tender, especially if what you're talking about is almost a niche-like or a relatively small part of sort of profit opportunity. Well, so that's two of the levers, price and volume. A third lever, and this is the one potentially for the best sort of win-win solution, is you lower their costs. And so anything we can do to lower the costs of participating is going to make it a more attractive offer. So how can we reduce the costs? Well, to some extent, the costs of production are outside the policymaker's hands. That's more with the firm itself, but there can be substantial regulatory costs. Anything that we can do as policymakers to make it easier to contract, easier to participate in these markets, will increase the perceived profitability and the desired. The fourth and the fifth are levers, or maybe in a sense, some of the more interesting ones. One of these levers, or the fourth lever I'll flag, is the uncertainty or the risk issue. Going into any of these ventures is nobody really knows what the total volume may be, what the ultimate prices may be. No one really knows what the future is going to be like. And anything that we can do to reduce that uncertainty effectively reduces the cost, but it makes it a more attractive option. And so that's really important. Make all of the metrics by which contracts are awarded, create as much transparency for the for-profit firm as we can. And then the last one, and this almost wraps back to the social responsibility, is there is an issue of spillover effects. And so to the extent that participating in one market or with one product makes it more attractive, easier, or lowers the costs of participating in some other market, that'll increase the incentive to participate. the spillover effects, I don't think are a really big one, but all those other 4 levers, I think we can almost keep coming back to any of these discussions about which one of these levers are we talking about. And when we're twisting one of those levers to make it more attractive for the for-profit firm, what's the cost to the policymaker? Is it a 0-1 or a complete transfer where what benefits the for-profit firm comes completely out of the pocket of the policymaker, or is it something where there are benefits?
Thank you, Greg. That's very helpful. So it sounds like you've got 5 levers. So price, volume, lower the cost, transaction costs, basically lowering the costs, reducing uncertainty, and potentially increasing positive spillover effects. Vivian, is of those 5 that Greg has just thrown out, which one do you think, or 2, if you think that's a good way to go, which ones do you try to play with in your position at the foundation? Or which one do you think is the most effective to play with? Or do you really have to play with all of them realistically in order to increase engagement?
We do have to play with all of them. And I think that there's roles that we as donors and as, talking more broadly about other multilateral organizations, there's a role that all of us play in all of these different levers. I'll sort of talk to a couple where I feel like there's unique and important questions, and that's probably the lowering the cost of participation and on the uncertainty factor. On the uncertainty factor, I like when Greg talked about risk. I think that there is a lot of risk in the system, and there's a lot of, especially when it comes to R&D and who bears that risk and when. I think one of the biggest challenges that I see in the environment going forward is, in particular, post-COVID, there's actually a lot of money going into R&D. There's a recognition that, in particular, this new technology of mRNA vaccines was quite transformative, and there's a lot of ways to leverage that technology for solutions across the board, both high income and low income. So how do we keep the interest on low income targets? Well, a lot of that is going to be about removing the risk of entering those markets for these organizations. And that's a lot of times about early R&D risk. The challenge is going to be is that because there's so much more money in the system, that donor money just isn't going to be as big. I mean, we saw that, frankly speaking, with the development of the COVID vaccines. The money that was the R&D money coming from places like CEPI was far dwarfed by the amount of government funding that was going into, development of these vaccines. And so a lot of that will be about how can you take earlier risk, how can you secure access, how can we make stronger access agreements to access these technologies at an earlier stage and de-risk the products themselves. And I think on the back end, it's a lot in the uncertainty side, and this is a little bit where the work that we've done with WDI in the past is, how do we make clear where there's market opportunity? And it's not just the total demand volume, but what is the volume? So I mentioned target product profiles earlier. What is the presentation that is necessary? So one thing we've talked a lot or worked a lot about is how are vaccines administered? There's potential for so much innovation in, just the basic needle and syringe. But, what is the problem we're trying to solve and where are the actual barriers? There's actually a lot of confusion out there. There are a lot of innovations that sort of solve for the wrong problem because there's just a lack of understanding of where the bottlenecks exist and how those bottlenecks intersect. And so a lot of what we can do is sort of unlock and provide transparency around that, so that creates an understanding of where there's actually demand and where there may be willingness to pay for that innovation.
Sorry, I'm muted there. Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. And on the risk side, I mean, both you and Greg alluded to the concept of risk, and you talked about primarily on that R&D side, that early stage R&D, that maybe the role of the donors is to de-risk that part and hope that if things go well, money will flow in naturally when it becomes clear it's an attractive or at least much less risky investment. I wonder if, Subhash, you might think about, or you might be able to talk to us a little bit about risk associated with other types of risks. So there's potentially risk related to reputational risk. There's risk related to there are just different forms of risk that any company faces. As you were, how did you take in risk, and how did you incorporate that into your decision making process when you were looking at trying to serve low and middle income markets?
First thing is passion. There is no other incentive than a passion to do something like that. And when I was working in Serum Institute, I must say that the chairman of the company, Dr. Poonawala, I myself, and my colleague, Dr. Jadhav, who's not there at this moment. So all of us, had the same kind of thought of consolidating our executive powers, the financials that were there in the company, driven to sort of work in this zone. Without that, this is not possible, because an amount of things that you may say that would save cost and all, they don't work. Reality is almost everything has an innovation attached to it that has made that product possible at a particular price. I'll give an example. We had the WHO path and the foundation group wanted to make meningitis conjugate vaccine, and they were finding it difficult that the multinational companies were not interested to make this at a low price. And then the group had visited our company at that point, Serum Institute, and Dr. Poonawala at that time felt that that was difficult because we are not experts, or we didn't have much experience in the conjugate field. And so Dr. Jadhav at that point of time asked me what was my opinion, because I had a lot of knowledge in the manufacturing sector or even in the R&D of doing things. And I said, yes, we must take this up. And then we committed to a price at that point of time. Believe me, we had not worked out any mechanics, any costing or anything like that. And we did that. And Dr. Kunal was very upset that we gave a price without this kind of calculation. The challenge then was to make that successful. So that intent and that passion of trying to then innovate and then try to bring in the basic technology, efficiency, etc., results into something that is success. Even today, I must say that we at InventPrice are working on making a PCV25 in America, which is going to be focused on for the low income countries. And the question is, how is this going to be made possible when you know what's the prices of this conjugate vaccine in the world? So one of the things that I discovered that would make this possible was bring in automation in manufacturing. And the design that we have done for automation takes up the manufacturing level of about 85% automation in the procedure. Automation not possible is where we need to attach the media in it, or the buffer concentrates in it, or having to make the seed for inoculation. There you would need human hand. After that, the entire process has been designed to make it automized, and that has reduced the cost of overheads on per dose that is made. Second thing that I realized was, the longer the chain in purification, the less is the yield at the end of the day, because even if you have 85% recovery at each step, cumulatively, if your steps increase to 20 or 30, you have very low yield at the end of the day, and that cost increases. And if we are able to shorten that with the chain, then you have a better product quantity, and that can then make the prices low. So these are some of the things, but the passion of a group or a person or a company is extremely important to do there.
So, I mean, I like the idea of passion driving decision makers, but I wonder if we can count on more than you or more than your organization as a private sector to say, look, you know what, we're gonna say we can do it for this price, but we haven't actually calculated it out. And that's actually something that goes back to this price volume lowering the cost of, there are going to be people in the private sector, they're going to say this is the right thing to do, and therefore we're going to do it. We're going to take at least a short-term loss to do this in the hopes that perhaps we're going to gain profit in the long term. But from my end, it seems like we need to find ways to at least show the private sector opportunities for them to make profit in at least the long term, if not in the short term. Michael, so you talked about engaging a number of private sector organizations within the Global Fund. Are there types of incentives that you've seen offered that you think are particularly useful for enticing the private sector's engagement? Is it simply the promise of profit that we were just talking about there, whether it's in the short term or the long term, or are there other incentives that come into play?
Well, I mean, I think when you're talking about the public sector, the problem is you're talking about public sector money that runs through public sector channels, which is basically public financial management. And as we know, this isn't even related just to the private sector, but the public sector, particularly in low-income countries, often has challenges in its public financial management system and isn't able to disperse the budget in a timely fashion. So this is going to create a lot of problems for the private sector to not be paid, on time in full. So in terms of de-risking, I think there's a lot of de-risking involved in getting the PFM system to work and potential different solutions around that. So obviously one of them might be guarantees, from donors so that the private sector can be assured that they're eventually going to get paid, but they could get paid up front by the donors and then eventually get paid back through the public financial management channels. I think we haven't done enough about that around de-risking the public financial management channels. And that's really been the real challenge around PFM actually reforms. I think more recently, one of the interesting things, and it's been done in Tanzania and other countries, there's some discussion, is what some people are now referring to as direct facility financing. So that's actually that if the facility has its own bank account and then there are clear decision rules about like the payment system, then the facility gets the money. And if the facility has a certain amount of decision rights, obviously with oversight, say, for example, they can buy supplies or pharmaceuticals, not just from the central medical stores, but from other, say, certified or accredited providers. The best example of that is the prime vendor model in Tanzania. So if the central medical stores can't actually provide the supplies, the facility is allowed to buy from a selected certified provider in each county. So I believe those kinds of models that kind of work within the public financial management system and create hybrids is going to be the most powerful solution, I think, really, because it both gives like some say to the public sector so that it's not completely bypassing it, but at the same time allows participation of the private sector. And I think direct facility financing is actually a very powerful tool that potentially could actually be transformational in some of these supply chain and service delivery reforms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are all these barriers and impediments to any type of market. And Subhash, you were with the Serum Institute of India for a long time, and you produced more vaccines in low and middle income countries than I think any other company in the world. Looking back at that time, were there impediments that you were seeing that you viewed as, quote, unnecessary, either put up by countries or donors that prevented you from doing more? So could you have done more, basically? If you didn't have that passion, could you have done more if one or more impediments weren't put up? And if so, could you talk a little bit about what those impediments were? Was it similar to what Michael said? Was it look, the countries don't have the ability to disperse money quick enough, so I'm unwilling to sell to country X or country Y, things like that. Did you run into that?
Two things. One, I want to first complete, this donor issue that comes in. And, I always feel indebted to the Gates Foundation for, doing this kind of investments in various projects, because that is something that helps reduce the cost of finance and kind of do. And then the running of the plant is the innovation that the company has to do. So you have finance that comes in to establish a system, and then the innovation part of the individuals in the company to take it forward. So that makes a very good economic model for getting into the low middle income country vaccine manufacture. So that's the thing. As far as the impediments are concerned, in 1989, when we wanted to pre-qualify our measles vaccine, that was a challenge, I must say, because at that point of time, the major suppliers were European companies, manufacturing and putting in the vaccine. And then to go into a country like India and think that those vaccines would come in at a competitive range was impossible to imagine. I can tell you that mindset of people at that time was really pinching, I would say, really pinching. And also because the private sector came into an action in somewhere in that region in India, it was basically the public sector that was supplying the vaccines. The qualitative aspect of what we are doing, or the impression that one has to give on the level of quality from an international perspective, had to be also grown up to show that what you are investing in as a possibility of making those vaccines, you could stand up to that in terms of quality, you could stand up to that in terms of the regulatory requirements and all. So this bridging of things at that point of time was a difficult part through which we went. And once that was kind of eased off, and when WHO saw that we were supplying vaccine in good quantities and in quality level, the more confidence, in that possibility increased. And maybe other companies that came on the scene afterwards had this door open to them, and we had made this thing very easy. And then, of course, now the developing country vaccine manufacturers become a big, important factor in supply of vaccines. So these difficulties, of things would be there, but I will not say that there exists something that becomes very difficult for somebody to go there. Yeah. It was there in the beginning when we began the journey, but of late, I don't think that exists.
Yeah. So I want to follow up a little bit on what you just said about quality. And Vivian, I'm going to ask a question of you. So this WHO and pre-qualification can be a hurdle for a lot of companies trying to get their products into markets. What do you see as the role, if anything, of global donors to helping private sector companies bridge that gap, get pre-qualified, allow them a mechanism to get in countries that they don't have the ability necessarily to navigate, because these are very different systems and potentially the systems they're used to working with in their country. Vivian, do you have any thoughts on that, or able to speak to that at all?
I think that the WHO pre-qualification system has actually been an incredible system in terms of providing an avenue through which we can sort of evaluate and at least create a standard for quality that regulators globally can look to. And that bar is important. But obviously, it's a process to navigate. And I think that there's a lot that we can do, and a lot that we do in terms of providing technical support to various different organizations to help them meet WHO pre-qualification such that those products have access to the broader market. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot of the value, I think, that large organizations play, like donors like the Gates Foundation and others, actually doesn't really necessarily come just from the funding we're getting to de-risk a particular product, though obviously there's a lot of work that we do there, but actually it comes from being able to bring, a cadre of subject matter experts who can help transfer knowledge, whether it be about the pre-qualification process, whether it be about, how to build quality systems within organizations and sort of raising the bar. And we've seen that with multiple developing country. I work in the vaccine space, so multiple developing country vaccine manufacturers where, supporting them to get to a pre-Q status once has spillover effects over to other products going forward, and they become stronger partners overall in the sector.
Yeah. So to what extent, a quick follow-up question, Vivian, to what extent do you think that private sector companies are aware of those resources? So it's fantastic, of course, that you're able to provide that, but if I'm a small company in Kenya, for example, and I think, we have the capability to do this, but we don't even know where to start. How does that work? Are we just going to the GSKs and the Mercks of the world, or are we really trying to help those that are, smaller companies that may be homegrown companies within those markets?
I think that's where we don't do a good enough job now. I think that's actually the real path forward of, and when we think about, broader inclusion of the private sector more widely in the broadest definition and casting the net wider, as I was mentioning earlier, I think a lot of that is about what are we doing from, I don't want to call it capacity building, because I think that that's sort of cheapening what it is. It's really about what are we doing in terms of creating transparency? What are we doing in terms of creating greater access points into the global health network? How are we making training more accessible? We have some partnerships with the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturer Network, DCVMN, in order to provide training. We work with organizations like PATH to try to expand those resources. And I think there's a lot of work happening now, especially in the context of these conversations around decolonizing global health, around how can we do more in the workforce development space? And I think that's a real area of interest. What can we do to efficiently and effectively sort of raise all boats?
Right. So Michael, reflecting on what Vivian just said, what do you think global donors should be doing to reduce those impediments? So for example, I could imagine you would say, our job is to help surface information, whether that's about demand, whether that's about, anything, basically a surfacing of information. I could also imagine you saying, our job is to influence policy. For example, encourage countries to make changes about how they do procurement, or even how, as you mentioned, as you were alluding to earlier, Michael, about how you finance your health delivery units. Where do you see that line in terms of how the global donor should be operating in this space?
Well, I think pre-qualification is an interesting model, and if it could be made to work better, I mean, I think it could be an even more powerful tool, because there are a lot of wraparound issues that are related to pre-qualification. As you say, how do firms have the information? Like we had a very interesting issue in Eastern Europe because a lot of the countries, Ukraine and Belarus, actually had their own domestic manufacturing of tuberculosis drugs, particularly for first line, which were not WHO pre-qualified. But of course, the country, for domestic policy reasons and industrial policy, wanted to buy from those. And one of the questions is, could we actually upgrade those facilities and then potentially make them, they could access larger markets if they got pre-qualification, and what would it take to get them to go to pre-qualification? And so I think, with innovative donors like the Gates Foundation, working with multilateral development banks, I think that might be in the realm of possibilities. That would also include like the IFC, but we haven't seen that much work in that area really, particularly with the greater emphasis around domestic manufacturing and stuff like that. But I mean, the other thing is like the Global Fund pool procurement mechanism and trying to give countries access to that pool procurement platform through WAMBO. I mean, so I think there are like a lot of different, particularly pooled mechanisms and some global mechanisms like the GDF that are possible. But when we start getting down to the country level, then we need to probably work with partners like the IFC or others to kind of de-risk the environment. I think guarantees around the PFM system is really one of the big missing blocks that we haven't really addressed as a donor community, because I think the donors could guarantee, payment to the private sector, and then recoup that money from the government. And I haven't really seen that happening actually. So sadly, but I think that's a mechanism that could be put in place.
So Greg, as an economist, do you have any response to what you've heard so far about how the global donors see their two global donors who are working in a space see their role?
Yeah, I think it's all consistent, and I want to loop back a little bit to what Vivian was just saying about the information to some of the firms. Is again, when you think from the perspective of a firm trying to decide, do I want to participate in an arena, whether it's purely to go after profits or because of the passion, but recognizing that passion still has to be backdropped with the ability to recoup some of the money, it seems like one of the biggest impediments for a lot of these areas is really how much demand are we ultimately going to have? So it's uncertainty about that volume lever. And it's one thing for a Merck or a GSK to have some pretty good market research about a particular vaccine or a particular country. It's asking a lot more of a smaller firm, the homegrown firm, who may be thinking about extending either into a different product in its own region or perhaps going into a different region. Giving as much certainty as we can may be one of the biggest impacts as to the profitability, or called the viability, of entering into this other product. And that's particularly true because when you think of a lot of these products or services that we're talking about, they're fairly high fixed cost. And what that means is that the incremental volume is going to be the most profitable. And so if you're going to, depending just how much output you're going to have, if you're off by that estimate of volume by 20%, that's a huge impact to the financial viability of what's going on. So I think, and this is one of the nice areas where reducing the firm's costs, making it a more attractive option, may be relatively low cost from the donor perspective. Just making sure there is much as low cost information out there about what future demand is expected to be. What do we know about how much sales, how much total demand there will be for this product, how it may be changing over time? Some of the donor organizations may have much better information about that than the individual firm who's trying to decide, do I want to get into this? The donor organization is also going to have a lot more information, or can provide a lot more information, in terms of how much is the donor going to fund? Because, whatever the demand for TB shots or malaria vaccines may be, who's going to pay for it? How much money will be there? Getting that information out there can be really important. And then I think the last sort of related thing that I would flag is there is going to be risk out there. There is going to be uncertainty. And I think this may go a little bit to some of what Michael was saying, is do we want to provide some guarantees to some of these firms? What firm is better, or what organization is better situated to take on the risk of the uncertainty about what future demand will be? And, frankly, a big organization, whether we're talking about something like the Global Fund or Merck or GSK, is going to be much better situated to take on the risk of uncertainty than a much smaller firm that we're trying to induce to start participating in some of these areas. So I think all those things are important. Get as much information and education about the process. And that's probably important as well. If we want to induce other firms, whether it's a big multinational or a small firm, to participate in some of these other markets, educate them, let them know what they're getting into, what we want them to get into.
Would anyone like to respond to Greg's final cap on that before we move on?
I have a couple of points. Because it's something I've been working on. One of the things that I've been working on was to try to get access to ICUBIA, or what historically been known as IMS private sector data, so that people knew the markets in these low income countries, because but the donors then need to put a bit of seed money in, because they're relatively small markets, and so it can't really function by the usual IQVIA business model of charging the pharmaceutical companies who want to enter the market. So that's a public good, and I've never been able to get anybody to contribute. I'm just mentioning that with a philanthropy in the room, because I think it's a public good, actually.
With that plug, so we've talked about the determinants of whether a private sector firm play in the market, and we've talked about some of the key impediments to them doing so. So Vivian, again, how does this discussion on incentives and impediments correlate to recent successes and challenges that we've observed? So, for example, COVAX or the malaria vaccine. Thoughts?
This is a hard question, to be honest. I think places where COVAX has fallen down and places where COVAX has had success. We'll start there. I think one of the biggest challenges for COVAX was it didn't have enough funding early on to place big bets and take on risk, right? It just, especially with ODA funding, a lot of it was the restrictions on that is you couldn't place $8 billion and just not care whether and just hope that one of them hit. That really put COVAX at the back of the line when it came to production schedules from all these other in comparison to all these other high income countries. And that's a really big challenge. If there's funding out there that could get in early and fast in a pandemic situation, that's a big deal. Where did COVAX have successes? I think in terms of the sort of alignment and uncertainty and pooling of, it's not just even pooling of procurement so much as pooling of needs. So, CEPI and COVAX ran a whole bunch of swap meetings where there were lots of discussions on things like regulatory barriers. What folks might not be aware of, there were a lot of conversations around packaging because, in a typical situation, each country has different packaging requirements. Could you even align what language was on the box? And all of that to earlier conversations. I think it was Greg who raised the idea, just, how do you lower the cost of production? But consistency, creating consistency does it. How do you think about expiration dates? What needs to be printed? All those conversations, being able to align globally to the extent possible, I think really, really lowers the bar and increases access. And so I think those are some of the successes that are on the table. And I do think another area was we talk a lot about tech transfer. How can we enable greater tech transfer? And I think one of the investments that COVAX was able to make very early on was the tech transfer of the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Novavax vaccine to Serum. And I think that's where a lot of the early doses that went into LMICs came because of a smooth tech transfer deal was able to be enabled. And there was not just the vaccine that was access to the vaccine or the ultimate sort of formula, but really the know-how of how to make it, where to make it, what are the nuances and challenges, what are the assays that are required, access to that clinical data, the ability to move that to expand production and have that production be dedicated to LMICs. I think that the wish is that there were more of those earlier and faster. But unfortunately, I think we're still chasing that.
Very interesting and super helpful for those of us who are not nearly as embroiled or knowledgeable about what was happening during COVAX, even though we were hearing the word COVAX all the time. So Michael, is there a particular success or failure related to private sector engagement that comes to your mind? And if so, what is it and why do you think it succeeded or failed?
Well, the one that I continue to reflect on is the Affordable Medicines Facility for Malaria, which was, I think, one of the most interesting innovations to try to tap into the private sector and global public health. And the idea was to subsidize ACTs, partially to sort of to crowd out monotherapies to prevent resistance, but also to increase access, to a very effective therapy. And it was piloted at the Global Fund to have like a ex post subsidy, actually. And then after about a couple of years, funding for it stopped, actually, because of controversy from some of the partners, actually. And so it was, I think, one of the biggest experiments really in private sector engagement. In fact, there was an evaluation done by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that was quite early on, after a year after which was actually quite positive, and yet ultimately it was, the funding for it was canceled. So the first thing, I think it raises the question that there's very complex political issues involved, both at the global and at country level, around engagement with the private sector. So some of it ideological and political, and that's important to take into account because it's not all about just reducing transaction costs or, price and quantity and stuff like that, that there's other factors at play. And that's, I think, why I often reflect on that issue, because I think it was a relatively successful pilot that may have succeeded technically, but actually failed politically, actually. And that's something that's worthy of us reflecting upon.
Quick clarification, was it a subsidization of the unit cost after the fact? What was it actually subsidizing? The cost of production, the price? What was the subsidization? Do you have
Well, it
any-
was a subsidy. It was to lower the price at the country level, you know, but it was ex post factory. So one of the questions was, you know, how well would the subsidy be transmitted down the supply chain? And then there was like secondary TA. So that was like one of almost like the research questions. If you do this kind of high level subsidy at the manufacturing level, you know, will it trickle down actually all the way to the consumer? But so it was a very, very interesting, you know, and it was done in like 8 countries and you know, so I mean, at the time there was a lot of concern about resistance to artemisinin, and so it was more driven by the resistance issue. But to be honest, it really was to increase access and increase access politically to the public sector. I mean, to the private sector. And I think one of the pushbacks was from the public sector, and particularly in the issue around RDTs, as increasingly, you know, that the question was, should people be able to access ACTs, you know, from private pharmacies? And then, you know, and then what about the whole RDT question of, you know, like, shouldn't they actually have malaria before they get a subsidized ACT? So.
Right. So you, I mean, so you're highlighting a technically sound thing that happened and then pointing out that it failed because of potentially failed because of ideological and political reasons. Who would have had the responsibility / ability to address that? Because I can imagine it's not the private sector company that's coming in and says, hey, I got this great product. Let me then go, you know, try to find a way so that this works within the public sector. They probably don't have the expertise or the understanding or even knowledge that this is a potential barrier for them. Is this something that donors, the role that donors can play? Who would have addressed this or who could have addressed this?
Well, I think it's a fragmentation within the donor community, but in this particular case, what I would say is that many of the disease-specific programs are very public sector oriented. And so this engagement with the private sector is kind of a new idea and somewhat alien idea, actually, you know, which is a more, you know, British NHS public sector kind of intervention. We should make the public sector work and stuff like that. So I don't think that you should necessarily assume that everyone agrees that, you know, the private sector is, you know, should be used in public health. Actually, that's like maybe an assumption from Michigan, maybe doesn't necessarily hold in other countries. So,
No, I
so
mean,
I think that is a dangerous assumption to make in a very highly politicized environment. And don't forget that the Alma Ata Declaration is really sort of an endorsement of a public sector model of both financing and service delivery. So
100% recognize that there are definitely groups and organizations that are not keen to have the private sector be further engaged. It was more of a question of, you know, if this is one of those barriers, if political / ideological barriers exist. I mean, question number 1 is, do we want them to go away? And question 2 is, who pushes them down? Who's the person that's going to address them? But
I think that's part of the problem, because there is no answer. Like, who would do that? I mean, that's my question. I don't think there is anybody who's necessarily serving that advocacy role within the ecosystem of global health, you know, which tends to be more public sector oriented. So I think that's something that one needs to think about how to make sure that maybe could happen, actually.
Greg, do you have any? Go ahead, Greg. Do you have any responses to that? I mean, it falls outside of the frame. I guess the ideological, political falls outside of your nice little framework that is very attractive to us. But maybe it's part of that uncertainty bucket.
No, Michael's flagging kind of the elephant in the room of what is realistically possible. I guess one of the questions I'd have to Michael on this is, it seems like one of the ways of trying to overcome this is trying to show the benefits of dealing with the political problems. And so I'm just a little bit curious. The studies that were done that did show that, in fact, the whole malaria initiative seemed to be pretty successful. Do you have a sense, did that have much headway in helping the resistance against the political pushback, or were the politics so severe that even confronting them with evidence of substantial savings didn't really have much impact? And where I'm going is, to what extent can additional studies showing potentially substantial benefits, is that a waste of time, or is it going to have much headway in changing things? Maybe it depends on the political environment and political players at the helm at the time, but I'm just a little bit curious on your
Well, I'm not sure that I really know the answer. It's something that I've always wanted to take time off and actually, like research in more detail. But I do think that a lot of the public health community would say that they're evidence-based, so that if you can generate evidence that would show that it was the case and address some of their concerns. In this concern, there was definitely concern about, whether or not people had malaria and the use of rapid diagnostic tests, which was quite a complicated issue. So I do think that is a legitimate concern. But what I would say more generally is that one shouldn't assume, that people will accept that the private sector, is more efficient. And so I think in certain environments that's true. But in general, in public health, I think there's kind of, more of a skepticism about the role of the private sector. And so that needs to be overcome. And then the politics of it need to be taken into account. And that's why I think the prime vendor model in Tanzania is such an interesting model, because it uses both the public and private sector. And it says, if the public sector is not working, you can buy from the private sector. So it creates this ecosystem that works for both in a way that I think, and so I think, interestingly, I think the prime vendor model, which was also to some extent difficult politically in Tanzania, but in this particular case, the political economy was such that the counties, which were newly independent, also wanted to get rid of stockouts for both, both politically and technically, because it would make them look good if they could solve the stockout problem, which had been a longstanding problem. So I do think that we need to pay attention to this in terms of finding a pathway forward, that it's not like we can just sort of provide evidence, but we need to think through like a stepwise political economy approach that would be successful as a reform strategy.
Yeah.
Just one more comment on that is some of your comments flagged to me something I'd mentioned to Pascal very early when we were sort of kicking around ideas for this whole panel, is we've been talking about private sector involvement at a fairly gestalt level without necessarily specifying in what particular areas. And I think some of your comments flag what particular sectors, what areas do we really think private sector involvement is better or desirable versus the whole public sector role. And maybe one of the useful things going down the road is to really be a little bit more careful on sort of what particular arena do we want the private sector involvement, and why do we think that this increased involvement is better than the status quo of what's out there. And it strikes me, without being able to give any particular specifics, that there are probably some areas where the private sector probably really does offer some substantial incremental benefits relative to what the public sector can and has been doing on its own. In other cases, maybe the incremental value is not so great. And in some cases, maybe the push to bring in the private sector is almost more, I'll call it, sort of politically motivated. It's kind of the theory of the day, let's bring in private sector. But what we should be doing in all of these areas is starting out with, what is it that we think the private sector incrementally can be doing better than what's out there? Why do we really need them, in a sense? And I'm not saying that the answer is going to usually be we always need them or we never need them, but I think the benefits may be very different depending on what we're talking about.
Vivian, you were going to say something.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what Greg and Michael have highlighted, in particular that, there's the private sector isn't always welcome, and we can't take that as a base assumption. And there are areas where it doesn't make sense for the private sector to engage, and it really is about strengthening and investing in the public sector. But I think one of the challenges across the board is sometimes we come to this conversation assuming that everyone has the same base level of understanding. And I think one of the challenges I've seen in engaging is that actually we all see different parts of the elephant. And so what can we do to better share and create an understanding of, what are some of the challenges that the private sector is facing? Can we translate that to both governments and to civil society? Where is that? But also, how can we, what are the challenges that civil society sees and government sees, and how can we help translate that to the private sector? I think there's a role for intermediaries to sort of bring those organizations together and ensure not just that we're sitting at the same table, but actually listening and actually trying to understand and trying to find paths forward. I'm not saying that it is a straightforward and just about transparency type question. Obviously, it's way more challenging than that. But I think that there are times where there are assumptions that are being made, whether it be that private sector only cares about profit, right? Or that, that's the reason why, and they're never going to come to the table, or that, hey, civil society, all they want is everything for free. That's not necessarily the case. Sustainability matters to them as well. And so, sort of really providing an understanding of those challenges. One thing that was done sort of early on when we were working in COVID was we actually found, even within the internal Gates Foundation organization, obviously we have people who come from many, many different backgrounds. We actually had one of the sort of turning points for us is we sort of sat down and actually did a 101 on vaccine manufacturing and vaccine development. What are the challenges? Where are the barriers? Why is this necessary? And I think it really changed the thinking across the organization of, oh, what should we actually be advocating for? What are actually our challenges? And this is in a single organization where, we all share email addresses. There is still that gap. And so how can we better acknowledge that gap? PATH actually recently held a convening with civil society organizations to talk through, vaccine manufacturing and what are some of the challenges there. So to bring different players closer together to sort of understand, hey, what can we do to take this forward to drive greater impact from the private sector for global health.
That's incredible. So I have one last question for our panelists before we let you guys go on this Friday. So what is the one area you expect to see much greater engagement in the private sector in the next 10 years? Just one sentence. If you can distill it down to one sentence, that would be great. Let's say Vivian.
The one area, I can talk about what I hope. I'm not gonna place bets. But sitting where I sit, I think where we'll see a ton of innovation from the private sector is definitely in the vaccine development and manufacturing space. There is so much opportunity there to be applied to help so many different disease areas, and I think there's a massive role for the private sector to play.
Excellent. Subhash?
Put, an hybrid way of looking at this is more important. Private sector has its own strengths and its own importance, and also the public sector has its own importance and its strengths. Judiciously using which, where, and what is important.
Michael. Well, I would say from what I had said before that, I think at least in the development space that domestic sort of logistics like warehousing and trucking, and that's really going to be the place where we're going to see growth in the private sector. But just to say, sitting here in the UK and having just done some research related to like what's going on in the UK, I would say that artificial intelligence and big data are going to be transformational for the health system, actually. So I think that that's going to be the new area where we're going to see a lot of growth of the private sector, actually. So.
Excellent. And finally, Greg.
If I had to predict, I would say it's in areas that are already pretty related to what the private sector is doing for the developed country. So they're going to say, we're making a whole lot of money here without much incremental work. We can start selling it here as well. I wouldn't anticipate a whole lot of activity into great, big, new, expensive areas for them.
Excellent. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists and audience members for joining us today. And as a reminder, this will be posted as a video on the WDI website shortly. Thank you again, and have a wonderful weekend. Take care.